Every single morning, before the sun came up, a 7-year-old boy slipped out of bed, walked across a dark yard, and pressed his small, dirty hand against a stranger's window, not to knock, not to ask for anything, just to know that someone was in there, just to know the house was not empty. For weeks, the cowboy inside saw that handprint every morning and never once wiped it away. He did not know why he kept it. He only knew it was the first proof in 6 years that someone cared whether he was home. Then one morning he walked out to the yard, looked at his window, and the glass was clean, no handprint, nothing. And something inside that man, something he had been telling himself was fine, was not fine at all. What he did next is the kind of thing that reminds you what it means to choose a person before it is too late. This channel is where the wide open bondage sound of the American West meets the deepest parts of the human heart, cowboy stories, love that grows slowly in hard soil, the bond between a mother and her child, and the quiet truth that strangers can become the family you never knew you were missing. If that is the kind of story that stays with you, you are in the right place. This story carries a lesson that many of us learn too late. The people who matter most are often the ones who show up in the smallest, quietest ways: a hand on the glass, a cup of coffee poured without asking, a door that stays open. Love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits for you to notice before it disappears. And the most important thing you can do is notice before the window goes clean. If this story moves something in you, leave a like so more people can find it. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had someone like that in your life? Someone who showed up quietly and changed everything? Share this with one person who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about real people doing their best in hard country, subscribe and stay a while. There is always more to tell.
The truck gave out at 5:47 in the morning. No warning, no dramatic grinding of metal, just 3 rough coughs like an old man clearing his throat. And then silence. The kind of silence that sits on your chest. Nora Callahan kept her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead at the reach of the headlights across empty Texas road. Red dirt, dry brush. A sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be black or purple. Nothing out there that was going to help her. She did not hit the steering wheel. She did not swear. She had used up most of her swearing back in Houston, standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning reading documents she was never supposed to find. In the passenger seat, her son Eli slept with his cheek pressed against the window. He was 7 years old, and he slept the way only children can sleep, which is to say, completely, with his whole body, his sketchbook balanced on his knees and his mouth slightly open. He looked peaceful. She had worked very hard to keep him looking that way. Behind them in the truck bed, 2 suitcases, 1 cardboard box of toys, a manila folder stuffed with documents that included divorce papers not yet fully signed, a letter from a bank with the words, "Account suspended" in the first line, and a notice from a court in Harris County that she tried not to look at directly. In her wallet, $47. 1 credit card that had stopped working the day before yesterday. She got out of the truck, walked to the front, lifted the hood, and looked at the engine the way you look at a difficult piece of news, not trying to deny it, just reading it clearly so you know what you're actually dealing with. Fuel pump. She was almost certain, which meant this truck was not going anywhere under its own power today, tomorrow, or possibly the day after that. She pulled out her phone. 9% battery. 1 bar of signal that came and went like a ghost. Marfa was the destination. She had heard about it from a woman at a gas station outside El Paso, a stranger who had overheard Nora asking the attendant about towns with medical clinics. The woman said there was a clinic in Marfa that had been looking for nursing help for months. That was the entire basis of Nora's plan. A stranger's sentence at a gas station. $47 in a town she had never been to, and a rumor that there might be work. She had driven 400 miles on that. She stood at the open hood and breathed the cool pre-dawn air. Behind her, somewhere in the dark, something moved in the brush. Probably just the wind. She had stopped being afraid of things that moved in the dark somewhere around the time she was 26, working a field clinic outside Kandahar with a headlamp and a box of supplies, and the particular understanding that fear is mostly a luxury. That was a long time ago now. She heard a vehicle before she saw the lights. Coming from the west, slow, no rush. It pulled up behind her and stopped. Did not honk, just stopped. A man got out. Tall, wide in the shoulders. He moved the way people move when they are comfortable with physical space and have been for their whole lives. He looked at her truck, looked at the open hood, looked at her. He did not ask if she was okay. The answer to that was visible. He said, "Fuel pump." She said, "I think so." He walked over and looked at the engine for maybe 90 seconds. Then he straightened up. "Yep. You need a tow. Part has to come from Odessa. Call ahead, and you are still looking at 2 days minimum." His voice was flat and plain, like reading from a list. No embellishment, no attempt to soften it. She appreciated that more than she could say. She asked for the number of the nearest tow service. He read it off from memory. She turned back to call. Then Eli woke up. She heard the small shift of him sitting forward in the seat. Then his voice, quiet and without complaint, just a statement of fact. "Mom, I am hungry." She turned around, looked at her son, looked at the wallet in her hand, looked at the distance to town, which was still 11 miles according to the last sign she had passed. The man was walking back toward his truck. She said, "Do you know anywhere nearby to stay?" He stopped, looked back at her. Then he looked past her into the cab of the truck, at Eli sitting up with his cheek still creased from the window. The kid was awake now, but his face was flat. No expectation in it. No hope waiting to be either confirmed or disappointed. Just the face of a child who had learned over time that it was safer not to expect much. The man looked at that face for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said, "I have a converted barn room on my property. Clean, electricity, real bed, while you wait on the truck." Nora said, "How much a night?" He said, "Do not need to settle that right now." She said, "Yes, we do." He met her eyes for the first time. She noticed they were brown and steady and gave nothing extra away. He said, 6 in the morning, I need help in the horse barn. 1 night and breakfast in exchange for an hour of work." She looked at him for a few seconds, not deciding whether she trusted him. Deciding whether this was something she could accept without losing the last piece of herself that was still intact. She nodded. Once. He said his name was Cole McAllister. His ranch was 3 miles up the road. He would come back with his trailer for the truck after he got them settled. She woke Eli up and told him they were getting out. Eli climbed down from the cab, sketchbook tucked under his arm, and stood in the red dirt road looking up at the dark sky with an expression that was impossible to read. Cole's truck had the heat on. It smelled like leather and grass, and something that might have been coffee from earlier in the day. Eli sat in the back and pressed his nose against the window and watched the landscape roll by in the headlights. He did not ask where they were going. He had stopped asking things like that a while back. Nora stared straight ahead and thought about the $47 and the dead credit card and the clinic that might not even be hiring anymore. She thought about the fact that she had driven 400 miles based on a stranger's suggestion and was now riding in another stranger's truck at 6 in the morning in the middle of West Texas. Then she thought about Eli saying, "I am hungry," in that quiet voice, with no accusation in it, just a fact. She had made mistakes, real ones. But the thing about being at the bottom of something is that there is finally nowhere to look except straight up. The sky outside was turning from purple to a pale gray. Somewhere ahead, the lights of the McAllister Ranch came into view. The ranch came at them slowly, the way things do in flat country where you can see a long way before you arrive. A main house, wooden, 2 stories, the kind of building that looked like it had been repaired many times over many years and was better for it. A barn to the south, a long, low structure to the east that Cole told her had been converted from storage. Several corrals, all empty in the early dark. A single light burning on the front porch. Sitting under that light, in a wooden rocking chair with a coffee mug in both hands, was a woman who looked to be in her early 70s. small and upright, with white hair pulled back and sharp eyes that moved over Nora and Eli the moment they pulled in. Cole said, "That is my Aunt Ruth. She lives about a mile up the road, but she gets here early." Ruth set down her mug and stood as they got out. She looked at Nora, then at Eli, then at Cole. And she smiled just slightly with the corners of her mouth, the way people smile when they see something they have been quietly hoping for without ever admitting they were hoping. She said, "There is coffee and there are eggs. Come inside." Nora said, "We do not want to be any trouble." Ruth said, "If I did not want trouble, I would have stayed home. Come inside." The main house was clean and orderly and had the feel of a place that was maintained out of habit rather than pride. The furniture was old but not worn out. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something faintly wooden, like the walls themselves had been seasoned by decades of cooking. Nora noticed there were no photographs on the walls. Not one. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, there was a single framed picture face down on the wood. She noticed it and looked away. Cole showed them the converted room. It was in the long, low building east of the main house, end unit, its own door to the outside. Inside, a double bed, a small dresser, a mini refrigerator, a shared bathroom 2 doors down. The floors were swept. There was a folded blanket at the foot of the bed that looked handmade. It was not fancy, it was not pretending to be, but it had a dignity to it that made Nora feel for the first time in a long time that she was in a place that was being offered honestly. She asked about the price again. He said, "Work and meals until your truck is ready. After that, we figure out the rest." She said, "I need to know what the rest means before I agree to anything." He looked at her without irritation. Said, "Fair. $50 a day on top of the room and food, starting tomorrow." She nodded. He said breakfast was at 6:30 and the barn work started at 7. He left without ceremony. Eli had already found the bed. He sat on the edge of it, sketchbook open on his knees, and looked around the room with the quiet, observational eyes he always used when he was taking in a new place. He had done this in 4 different places in the past 3 months. Nora sat beside him. He did not lean into her, but he did not move away. She said, "This is just for a few days, until the truck is ready." He said, "Okay." She said, "You okay?" He said, "The man has horses." She said, "Yes." He said, "Can I see them tomorrow?" She said, "If he says it is all right, yes." He nodded and went back to his sketchbook. She watched him draw for a little while. He was drawing a horse. He had never been this close to horses before in his life, as far as she knew. He was drawing it from imagination, from what he had seen through the truck window in the dark. She told him to sleep. He put the sketchbook under his pillow and lay down without arguing. She turned out the light. The room was quiet. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere far off across the flat land. The sound echoed and then dissolved into the dark. Nora sat in the one chair in the room and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, Cole was already in the barn when she got there at 6:55. He handed her a shovel and pointed to the stalls that needed clearing. No greeting, no instructions beyond the pointing. He went back to what he was doing. She worked. It was hard and it smelled, and she had not done physical labor like this in years. Her shoulders ached within the first 20 minutes. She did not say anything about it. At some point, Eli appeared. He had eaten breakfast with Ruth, apparently, and had been given permission to come to the barn. He sat on the top rail of the fence outside the main stall, sketchbook on his knees, and watched. Inside the barn there was a chestnut mare, older, broad across the chest, with patient eyes. Her name, Cole said without being asked, was Biscuit. Eli looked at Biscuit for a long time. Then he said to Cole, "Can I go closer?" Cole looked at the boy. Then he said, "Walk slow. Hold your hand out first and let her smell it. Do not reach for her." Eli climbed down from the fence rail and walked into the stall, slowly, exactly as instructed. He held his hand out at about hip height, palm up. Biscuit turned her big head and breathed into his palm, a long, warm breath. Eli went very still. He did not smile, not the wide kind. He just exhaled all at once, like something that had been wound tight inside him finally let go. He stood there with the horse breathing on his hand, and his eyes were soft in a way they had not been for a long time. Cole watched from the barn doorway. Nora watched from 2 stalls down. Neither of them spoke. That night, around 10 o'clock, Nora heard the door of the room open quietly. She got up and looked outside. Eli was in the yard. Standing in the pale light from the main house porch, facing the far end of the building, facing the window of Cole's bedroom, where a low amber lamp was still on inside. He just stood there, looking at the light. Nora went out and crouched beside him. "What are you doing, buddy?" he said. "I wanted to see if somebody was in there." She said, "Why did you need to know that?" He thought for a second. Then he said, "So I know the house is not empty." She looked at her son and felt something press against the inside of her chest. He was 7 years old. He should not know what an empty house felt like from the inside, but he did. They both did. She brought him in. He climbed into bed without complaint. Before she turned out the light, he asked, "How long are we staying?" She said, "A few days, until the truck is fixed." He nodded and closed his eyes. She stood in the doorway for a moment after she turned the light out, listening to his breathing slow and even out. Then she went back to the chair and the ceiling, and the quiet. Cole was up at 5:30. He walked into the yard in the gray pre-dawn and turned toward the corrals out of habit, checking the fence line with his eyes the way he did every morning. Then he looked at his window. There was a handprint on the glass. Small. A child's hand, pressed flat to the surface with the fingers spread, the kind of print that comes from a hand covered in the fine red dust that settled on everything out here, clear and deliberate in the flat morning light. Cole stood in front of it. He was very still. He looked at that print for maybe a full minute, long enough that the sky shifted from dark gray to light gray around him. Then he turned and walked to the barn to start the morning feeding. He did not wipe it off. It was not that he forgot. He stood there long enough to have wiped it off 10 times over. He chose not to. He was not sure why, not in a way he could have put into words. He only knew that something about that small, dusty hand on his window in the gray morning made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like there was a reason to be exactly where he was. That feeling was strange enough that he wanted to be careful with it. He left the print and went to feed the horses. Day 3 brought a new problem. The part for Nora's truck was back-ordered from the supplier in Odessa. The shop called at 8 in the morning and told her it would be 10 days, minimum, before they could get the work done. The repair estimate was $480. She sat at the kitchen table with the phone in her hand and did the math that had become familiar. The math never came out differently. It always came out the same way. Ruth put a fresh mug of coffee in front of her and sat down across the table. Ruth had a way of sitting that said she intended to stay put and hear the truth, and she had a way of looking at you that made the truth feel more possible to say out loud. She said, "What is your actual situation?" And Nora, who had not told anyone the actual situation in 3 months, told her. She told her about Thomas, the 8 years, the way things had looked from the outside versus the way they felt from the inside, the business debts she had not known about, the other woman, the morning she found the documents, the drive west with Eli in the truck, and $47 in her wallet and a rumor about a clinic in Marfa. Ruth listened to all of it, did not interrupt, did not make the face that some people made, the one that was half sympathy and half calculation about how much trouble you were going to cause. When Nora finished, Ruth said, "You are going to have to talk to Cole." She found him at the north fence line, alone, working methodically along the wire with a pair of pliers and a spool of fresh fencing coil. He heard her coming but did not stop working. She stood across the fence from him and said, "I need to ask you something." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "I need more time. The truck is 10 more days at least, and $480 I do not have. I can work for my keep. You tell me what needs doing, and I will do it." He kept his hands on the wire. "What can you do?" she said. "Anything physical. I am not afraid of hard work. I was a nurse for 12 years before I was anything else, and before that I grew up on a property in Montana. I know how to follow instructions, and I do not complain. He glanced up at her for a second, and then looked back at the wire. "You take the boy to school mornings." She said, 7:30, every day. He said, "School is 4 miles up the road. I drive that way anyway." She said, "I can pay you back when I get work. I will sign something if you want." He straightened up and looked at her. His eyes were the same as the first morning, brown and direct and without judgment in them. He said, "I do not need a piece of paper. I need someone who shows up when they say they will." She said, "I will show up." He said, $50 a day on top of room and food. "Work starts at 6. You get Sundays." She said, "Thank you." He shook his head not unkindly. "Do not thank me. I need the help and you are here. That is all this is." He went back to the wire. She picked up the pliers he had set down on the fence post and handed them to him when he reached for them. He took them without comment. That was the arrangement. No documents, no handshakes, just two people who had agreed on the terms and were already working. The handprint was there again that morning. Cole had looked before Nora came to find him at the fence. Fresh print over the faded one from yesterday, slightly lower on the glass, the small fingers spread a little differently. He had stood in front of it for the same long moment as the day before. Then he had gone to make coffee. The days that followed had a shape to them. 6 o'clock, Nora at the barn. Cole already inside, the morning feeding half done. He would point to what needed doing, and she would do it. They did not talk much during work. There was a rhythm to it that did not require conversation. Task and completion, and the next task. At 7 o'clock, she drove Eli to school in Cole's truck, which he lent without being asked. At 7:30, Eli was at the school door, and she was on the road back to the ranch. At 3 o'clock, she was back at the school. At 3:30, Eli was in the barn with Biscuit and his sketchbook. $50 a day. Real meals. A room with a door she could close. It was not much. It was enough. Ruth was there most mornings and some evenings. She cooked better than anyone Nora had met in years. She had opinions about everything and stated them clearly, and did not wait to be asked. Nora found this restful in a way she had not anticipated. After 8 years of navigating what Thomas thought and wanted and needed, a person who said exactly what they meant was like standing in cool water. Cole did not volunteer much, but he was consistent in a way that Nora had almost forgotten a person could be. He said he would do something, and he did it. He said the truck would be handled, and it was. He said the work started at 6, and at 6 he was there. There was no drama around it, no announcement, just the thing, done. She had not been around that kind of reliability in a long time, and it made her feel, in the evenings when she sat with it, something she could not quite name. Not gratitude, exactly. Something older and more fundamental than that. On the evening of day 7, she was alone in the converted room after Eli fell asleep. She sat at the small table with a glass of water and her phone, which she had been using to look at job listings for Marfa and the surrounding counties. The clinic listing was still up. Part-time at first, full-time possible. Trauma and emergency experience preferred. She had trauma and emergency experience. She had more of it than most people ever wanted. She filled out the online inquiry form, hit send, then sat in the quiet and listened to the wind move across the flat land outside her door. Day 9. Evening. Eli was in bed. Nora came out of the room and walked to the porch. Cole was already there, sitting in the old wooden chair with a coffee mug in his hand. He looked at her when she came out. Neither of them said anything about the coincidence of both wanting air at the same time. She sat in the other chair. After a while, she said, not looking at him, "Your wife?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 2018. Car accident. She said, "I am sorry." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Did you have kids?" He said, "No." She said, "Did you want to?" That was probably too much. She could feel it land in the air between them, too personal for the arrangement they had. But he answered anyway. He said, she wanted to adopt. I kept saying not yet. Then there was not a yet anymore. Nora looked out at the dark. Said nothing because there was nothing to say to that. Cole said, "The boy's father?" She said, "Houston, he does not know where we are." "He does." Cole said, "By choice?" She said, "His." He nodded. They sat another 15 minutes without talking. Not uncomfortable. The particular quiet of two people who have agreed not to perform for each other. Then Cole said, "There is a black horse in the east stall. Rebel, Eli has been sitting near him every afternoon for a week." She said, "I know." He said, "Rebel let him come within 3 feet today. First time he has let anyone that close in 2 years. Nora turned and looked at Cole. In the dim porch light, his face was tired but not unkind. She said, "Eli does not give up on things." Cole said, "I noticed." He stood up, took the mug inside, and the door closed softly behind him. Nora sat on the porch alone for a while. The coyote was out there again somewhere, calling into the flat dark. She listened to it and thought about the words she had been turning over all week, the words she had been trying to find for what this place felt like. The word was not home. It was too soon for that, and she was too careful to use it. But it was something in that direction, something pointing that way. Every morning, Cole found the handprint. Sometimes fresh and dark, sometimes the previous day's print going pale in the sun. Sometimes Eli had pressed both hands side by side. On day 11, there was a small drawing scratched into the dust on the glass beside the print. A horse, four-legged and roughly square-bodied, clearly biscuit, made with one careful finger. Cole stood in front of the window and looked at the little horse for a long time. Then he went inside and poured his coffee and started the day. He had not told anyone about the prints, not Ruth, not Nora, not the boy himself. It was not something he had consciously decided to keep private. It was just something he kept. The way you keep a thing that has no category yet. On day 14, Derek Shaw came to the ranch. He drove a black F250 with a clean finish that stood out in the dust of the ranch road like a formal suit at a barbecue. He was 55, broad across the shoulders with silver at his temples, and clothes that were just a notch above practical without being ostentatious. He had the kind of face that made you think he had never been surprised by anything in his life. Cole was at the corral when he pulled in. He watched the truck stop, the door open, the man step down with a familiar ease. Shaw had been to this ranch before. He knew the layout. Shaw said, "Cole." "Good to see you," shook his hand the way people shake hands when the grip means something beyond hello. Nora was coming from the barn with an empty feed bucket. Shaw's eyes moved to her briefly, a flat, assessing glance, then back to Cole. Shaw said he had heard the past season had been hard on water, said he was concerned about how his neighbors were managing, said he had always admired what Cole had built out here on 200 acres. Then he made his offer. 50 acres on the east side, the rocky parcel near the dry creek bed. He named a price that was reasonable by any measure. Cole said, "No, thank you." Shaw said, "No rush. I understand that land is personal out here. Just wanted to put it on the table." Cole said, "It is not on the table." Shaw smiled, said, "Well, I am always around if you change your mind." He looked at Nora one more time, said, "Ma'am," then got back in his truck. When the truck was out of sight, Nora set the bucket down and said, "Who is he?" Cole said, "Derek Shaw. He owns about 3,000 acres in this county." Nora said, "He did not come here to buy land." Cole looked at her. She said, "He already knew you would say no. He came to see something." She paused. "What does he actually want from you?" Cole was quiet for a moment. He said, "The whole ranch, eventually." That evening, Ruth stayed for dinner. After Eli went to bed, Nora helped her with the dishes and Ruth started talking. She talked about the McAllister family. 3 generations on this land. Cole's grandfather, his father. How Cole came back from the rodeo circuit at 32 to take over when his father got sick and stayed. How he married Margaret, who was from a ranching family herself down near Alpine. How Margaret got sick in the fall of 2017 and then seemed to recover and then died in January of 2018 on a road she was driving alone in the early morning dark. Then Ruth talked about the debt. She said Cole had borrowed $240,000 in 2017 and 2018 to cover Margaret's medical costs and the estate expenses after. He had paid it down to $180,000. He paid it methodically, from the ranch income the way he did everything else. No drama about it. Nora dried a dish and said, "And Shaw." Ruth set down the pot she was washing, said, "What I am about to tell you Cole does not know I know, and he does not know I am telling you." She looked at Nora steadily. "Shaw bought the note from the bank 3 months ago, at a discount. He is now the one Cole owes the money to." Nora stopped drying the dish. Ruth said, "Cole thinks he still owes the bank. He has been making his payments to a different address, and I do not think he has looked closely at the name on the account." Nora said, "Who knows this?" Ruth said, "My accountant told me. He handles paperwork for both parties on different matters, and he felt I should know." She paused. "And now you do." The next afternoon, after school, Eli went to Rebel's stall. He did not go in. He sat on the floor of the barn aisle back against the wall, 4 feet from the stall gate. He had his sketchbook open. He was drawing. Cole came by on his way to the storage shed and saw the boy there. He stopped. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" Eli said, "Every day since you told me." Cole leaned against the wall across from him, said, "You have been sitting on a barn floor every day for a week." Eli said, "You said not to rush it." Cole looked at the horse. Rebel was at the back of the stall, nose pointed toward the boy, watching. Not comfortable, but watching. Cole said, "You draw him every time?" Eli held up the sketchbook. There were maybe 6 pages of horse drawings. Different angles, different poses, all clearly the same horse. Rebel in the stall, Rebel at the water trough, Rebel as Eli imagined him running, all legs extended and tail out. Cole looked at the drawings for a moment, said, "You are good." Eli said, "I have been practicing." Cole said, "How long have you been drawing?" Eli said, "Since my mom and dad stopped talking to each other." He said it plainly, the way children state facts they have accepted. He said, "Drawing is quiet. When everything else is loud, drawing is quiet." Cole had no response to that. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to the storage shed to get what he needed. But he took the long way back. On day 18, the handprint on the window had a companion. Eli had drawn 2 hands in the dust beside his own print. His small hand pressed clear and dark. And next to it, made with a careful finger tracing in the film of dust on the glass, the outline of a much larger hand. Cole's hand, sketched beside his own. Cole stood in the gray morning and looked at those 2 handprints, one real and one drawn, for a long time. Something in his chest moved in a way he was not expecting and was not sure what to do with. He went inside, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard while it brewed. Ruth came in at 7, looked at his face, said nothing, poured herself a cup and sat down with her newspaper. They drank their coffee in the familiar silence of 2 people who did not need to fill every quiet with words. Day 20, afternoon. A calf was in trouble. One of the younger heifers in the north pasture had been laboring too long. Cole found her at 3 o'clock and knew immediately that the calf was presenting wrong. The nearest vet was in Alpine, 45 minutes away. He made the call, but 45 minutes was a long time. Nora came up behind him. She looked at the animal for a few seconds. Then she was down on one knee in the grass without any announcement, her hands moving with a precision that had nothing to do with uncertainty. Cole said, "You have done this before." She said, "Yes." He said, "Where?" She worked as she talked. Her hands were steady and her voice was steady, and she moved like someone who had done difficult physical things in difficult circumstances and had never expected anyone to notice or applaud. She said she grew up with a veterinarian father in rural Montana. She said she was a trauma nurse for 12 years, including 2 years with a civilian medical support team in Afghanistan. She said she had handled things considerably messier than this in conditions considerably worse. 27 minutes later, the calf was breathing, And the mother was settling, and Nora was sitting back on her heels in the afternoon grass, wiping her hands on a clean rag. Cole said, "Why did you leave nursing?" She was quiet for a beat. Said, "I was asked to." He said, "By who?" She said, "My husband. He said I did not need to work anymore, that he would take care of things." She paused. "I was tired." I believed him. The calf's legs were moving now, uncertain and strong. The mother turned and began cleaning it with long strokes of her tongue. Cole said, "What happened to the person you were before you stopped working?" She looked at him. The question surprised her, he could see that. Most people would have asked what happened to the marriage. She said, "She is still in here somewhere." She looked down at her hands. "I have just been trying to find her again." Cole nodded. He looked at the calf standing for the first time in the afternoon sun on unsteady legs. He said, "She seems to be doing all right." Nora looked at him. A small sound came out of her that might have been a laugh, or the beginning of one. Aborted. She said, "Yeah, I think she is going to make it." The vet's truck came up the ranch road 10 minutes later. Cole met him at the gate. Nora had already walked back toward the house, her silhouette moving through the afternoon light with the ease of someone who had just done a hard thing and did not need acknowledgement for it. Cole watched her go, then turned to meet the vet. That evening, a letter arrived from a law office in Odessa. Cole read it at the kitchen table. It informed him that his loan had been formally transferred to a new holding entity, effective 6 weeks ago, and that the next payment was now due 90 days earlier than his original schedule. Completely legal, standard language throughout. Cole set the letter on the table. His face did not change. But Nora was refilling her coffee at the counter, and she saw his hand tighten on the paper until the edges bent. She looked at the return address on the envelope. She looked at Cole. She said nothing. She took her coffee and went to check on Eli. But she had seen what she needed to see. The handprint on the morning of day 21 was different. Still there. Still the small, dark palm and spread fingers that Eli left every morning at some point before 6 o'clock. But this morning there was a word beneath it, written carefully in the grime on the glass, each letter formed with a single finger. The word was home. Cole stood in front of the window and read that word for a long time. His coffee got cold in his hand. He thought about what it meant that a 7-year-old boy who had been in this place for 3 weeks had written that word on this window. He thought about what kind of year that boy had been through to reach a place where he was writing that on a stranger's window before the sun came up. He thought about the fact that when he looked at Eli writing that word, the thing he felt was not discomfort or pity. It was something more like recognition. He went inside and poured the cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh cup. Nora got a call from the Marfa clinic on day 22. The director wanted to meet. She asked if Nora could come in Thursday. She said yes before the woman finished the sentence. She told Cole at breakfast. He said he could cover Eli's school pickup if the meeting ran long. She said she did not want to impose. He said, "You are not imposing." He got up and took his plate to the sink. She looked at the back of his head for a moment and thought about the way he said things. Flat and direct and without the kind of layered meaning she had spent 8 years learning to decode. He said, "You are not imposing." He meant, "You are not imposing." She had forgotten that was possible. She called Ruth that afternoon and told her about the clinic meeting. Ruth said, "Good." She said it the way you say the word when you have been waiting for the right thing to happen, and it has finally started to happen. Thursday came. The clinic was in a low brick building at the south end of Marfa's main street. The director was a woman named Dr. Vasquez, maybe 60, practical and direct in a way Nora recognized and respected. Dr. Vasquez said they had been understaffed for 2 years. She said they served ranchers and farm workers in a 60-mile radius, and that most of those people had not had consistent access to quality care in a long time. She said she was looking for someone with actual emergency experience, not just clinic experience. Nora put her resume on the desk. Afghanistan was on it. The trauma unit in Houston was on it. Dr. Vasquez read it in about 90 seconds. Then she looked up and said, "When can you start?" Nora said, "I need to arrange childcare." Dr. Vasquez said, "My sister runs the after-school program at the elementary school. I will make a call." Nora drove back to the ranch with a part-time offer in her pocket and the beginning of something that felt cautiously like solid ground. That evening at the barbecue that Junie Parks held every year at her property 2 miles down the road, Nora met the community. Not all of them, but enough. Junie was warm and loud in a good way, the kind of person who held a room together without trying. She introduced Nora to ranchers, to their wives, to the woman who ran the feed store, to the retired school teacher who had lived in Marfa for 50 years and remembered Cole's grandfather. She introduced Eli to 2 boys his age, and 10 minutes later, all 3 of them were running in the yard with the dog. Nora stood with a plate of food and watched Eli run and felt something that she did not have a precise name for. Something that lived in the area of relief, deep and physical. The kind that comes when you realize a thing you were afraid might be permanently broken is in fact not. Junie found her at some point and stood beside her watching the kids. Junie said, "How long are you staying?" Nora said, "The truck is almost ready." Then she said, "I got a job offer today, at the clinic." Junie looked at her sideways. She said, "Cole know that?" Nora said, "Not yet." Junie nodded, took a bite of her corn, said, "He has not brought anyone to this barbecue since Margaret. He usually comes for 45 minutes and then goes home." Nora said, "He has been here 2 hours." Junie said, "Yes, ma'am, he has." She said it without emphasis, looking straight ahead at the yard where Eli was now trying to teach the dog a trick. Later, near the fire, Junie cornered Cole with the ease of old friendship and said, "Is she staying?" Cole said, "That is her call to make." Junie said, "But what do you want?" Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and walked to talk to someone else. Junie watched him go. She did not look disappointed. She looked like a person who had just confirmed something. On day 25, another letter arrived from the Odessa law office. This one was more specific. It cited a clause that allowed the new creditor to accelerate the payment schedule under certain conditions. The conditions described were vague enough to be applicable to almost anything. The upshot was that Shaw, through his holding entity, could call the full remaining balance of $180,000 within 60 days if he chose to. Cole read the letter twice. Then he set it in the top drawer of his desk and went to work. Nora saw him come back from the mailbox. She saw his face before he rearranged it. She did not say anything then. That night, after Eli was asleep, she sat at the small table in the converted room with her laptop and the notes she had asked Ruth to help her pull together, and she started reading loan documentation. She was used to reading documents under stress. She had done it in field conditions with worse light and less time. She read carefully, and she made notes, and she looked things up, and she read some more. She did not find what she was looking for that night. But she knew it was in there somewhere. There was always something in the language if you read carefully enough. She went to sleep at 1 in the morning and was back at the barn at 6, day 28. A storm came in from the northwest without much warning, the way Texas storms do, with the particular arrogance of weather that does not owe you notice. They needed to get the cut hay from the east field into the barn before the rain hit. 3 people's work minimum. Ruth was there by chance, came by to drop off something for Cole. Eli had just gotten home from school. All 4 of them went to the field. It was hard, urgent work, the kind that does not leave room for thinking about anything else. The wind came up first, and the hay tried to blow back out of the wagon as fast as they loaded it. Eli worked without complaining, stacking beside Cole in the wagon bed, both of them bent against the wind. They got the last load in 7 minutes before the rain hit. Then all 4 of them stood under the barn overhang and watched the rain come down in solid sheets across the flat land, breathing hard, arms tired, covered in hay chaff. Eli said, "We made it." Cole looked down at the boy. He said, "Yeah, we made it." They stood there together in the noise of the rain on the metal roof. Nora watched Cole with her son and felt the shift she had been feeling for a week now. that slow recalibration of what she had been expecting from the world. She had arrived here with $47 and a dead truck, and the specific emptiness of someone who had spent years waiting for a life that never quite arrived. And here was this man, standing in the rain with her son, not performing warmth, not saying the right things, just there, just present in a way that required nothing from her in return. She looked away before Cole could see her looking. That evening, after the rain, they sat on the covered porch. The air was washed clean. The land smelled like wet earth and grass. Cole said, "You should know about Rebel." She said, "What happened to him?" Cole said, "Previous owner, a man who thought that fear was a training tool. Rebel was 4 years old when I got him. He had been beaten enough times that the connection between a human coming close and something painful happening was about as deep in him as anything goes." She said, "How did you work with him?" He said, "Time. Consistency. Never moving faster than he could accept. Never punishing him for being afraid." He paused. "It took about a year before he would let me touch him without flinching." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now he lets the boy sit 3 feet from his stall every afternoon, which is more than he allows most adults." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is how your aunt described you, actually." He looked at her. She said, "Not those words, but the same principle." He said, "Ruth talks too much." She said, "Ruth talks exactly the right amount." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in the direction of one. She looked at the dark yard and said, "I took the job at the clinic." He did not say anything right away. She said, "Part-time to start. Dr. Vasquez wants someone who can do field triage, not just clinic work." She looked at him. "I know our arrangement was temporary," he said. "It does not have to be." She looked at him. He said, "The work is here. The room is empty anyway." She said, "Cole, that is not a reason to let us stay." He said, "I know what my reasons are." He said it quietly and looked straight ahead at the dark yard. Nora looked at the side of his face for a moment. She thought about Margaret's photograph, face down on the mantel. She thought about not yet, not yet, not yet, and then no more time. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Do not thank me. Just keep showing up at 6. The next morning, day 29, a different kind of letter arrived. Not from the law office this time. Directly from Thomas. Nora read it at the kitchen table after Eli left for school. Cole was outside. Ruth was not there yet. Thomas had found them. He was careful not to say how. He needed her to sign a document releasing her claim on a jointly held property on the east side of Houston, a piece of commercial real estate that was tangled up in a lawsuit from his former business partner. He needed her signature within 30 days. He said it would be a simple process. He said there was no reason to make things difficult. She read the letter twice. Then she set it face down on the table. She sat there for a long time. She thought about the 30-day deadline. She thought about what Thomas wanted, and what he would do if she refused, and what evidence she still had access to. In an email archive she had downloaded before she left Houston regarding his financial conduct over the previous 4 years. She thought about what it meant that he had found her. That afternoon she went back to the loan documents. She had been reading them in pieces for days. She had a yellow legal pad with 3 pages of notes. She read the original lending agreement again from the beginning, all 22 pages of it, making marks in the margins in pencil. On page 17, in a subsection that ran to 4 paragraphs of dense legal language, she found what she had been looking for. It was called a borrower protection provision, standard in certain types of agricultural lending agreements from the era when Cole's loan was written. The clause stated that if the creditor assigned or sold the debt to a third party, the original borrower retained the right to satisfy the remaining obligation at the price paid by the new creditor, not the face value, within 90 days of the assignment. Shaw had purchased Cole's $180,000 debt at a 30% discount. He had paid $126,000 for it. Cole had 90 days from the date of transfer to pay $126,000 and be free of it entirely. She counted back from the date on the first letter. The transfer had happened 43 days ago. That meant Cole had 47 days left inside that window. She checked her math 3 times. Then she sat back and looked at what she had. She went to find Cole. He was in the equipment shed working on the tractor. She stood in the doorway with the legal pad in her hand and said, "I need to show you something." He looked up. She walked him through it, slowly, clearly. The provision on page 17, the discount rate, the 90-day window, the 47 days remaining. She put the legal pad on the workbench beside him and pointed to each item as she explained it. When she finished, he looked at the numbers for a while without speaking. Then he said, "Where did you find this?" She said, "In your loan documents." "I have been reading them for a week," he said. "Why?" She held his gaze. She said, "Because somebody needed to." He looked at her for a moment, something in his face that she could not fully read. Then he looked back at the legal pad and said, $126,000 in 47 days. She said, "Is that possible?" He said, "I do not know." Slowly. "I would need to think about what I could move." She said, "There may be other sources." She paused. "I think you should talk to Ruth. And I think you should call a lawyer in Odessa, not here in town." She looked at him steadily. "Shaw has been patient and quiet and legal throughout all of this. You need to be too." Cole looked at the number on the pad. Then he looked at her. He said, "You did not have to do this." She said, "Yes, I did." She left the legal pad on the workbench and walked back to the house. That night, Eli put his hand on the window as always, but underneath the print he wrote something else. Just a question, formed carefully in the dust. It said, "Are you okay?" Cole read it in the gray morning and felt something he had not expected. He felt grateful, not for the question, for the fact that someone was asking it, for the fact that someone was standing outside his window before the sun came up and wanting to know. He stood there for a long time. Then he went inside and got his phone and called a lawyer in Odessa. The next 2 weeks had a shape to them, too, but different from the weeks before. Cole had 2 conversations with the Odessa lawyer. The man confirmed the provision, said it was airtight, said they needed to act carefully and document everything. Cole started moving pieces. He called the livestock broker he had used for 15 years, identified 20 head of cattle he could sell without seriously compromising the herd, the older animals, the ones past their prime breeding years. The broker said he could have buyers within a week. Ruth came over one evening after Eli was in bed and sat at the kitchen table with Cole and put a bank envelope in the middle of the table. She said $35,000 from the Pecos County property I sold in 2019. Cole said, "I cannot take your savings." Ruth said, "You are not taking anything." "I am giving it." She looked at him directly. "I have been watching this ranch hold this family for 3 generations, Cole. If you lose it to a man who bought your debt at a discount to strip you out of it, I will not forgive myself for sitting on money that could have helped." She pushed the envelope closer. "Do not insult me by refusing." Cole looked at the envelope for a long time. Then he put his hand on it and said, "I will pay you back." Ruth said, "Of course you will. That is how it works." Nora told Cole about the Marfa clinic job in more detail. She was starting on Monday. Full-time possible within 3 months if things went well. She said she was looking at apartments in town. She said she did not want to presume the room was permanent. Cole said, "The room is yours until you find what you need." She said, "That is very generous." He said, "I am not being generous." He handed her a mug of coffee. "I am being practical. Eli knows this place, and he is comfortable, and that matters for a kid his age." He paused. "And the work is still here if you want it." She took the coffee and said, "You know, for someone who does not talk much, you say the right things fairly often." He looked at her. She said, "I mean that as a compliment." The corner of his mouth moved again, that almost smile she had been cataloging for weeks now. On a Thursday evening, Cole came out of the barn and found Nora and Eli sitting together on the top rail of the corral fence. Eli was describing something with his hands, acting out what appeared to be a horse race, and Nora was laughing. Not politely, actually laughing, her head tipped back slightly, the sound of it real and unguarded. Cole stopped where he was, He stood there and watched them for a moment. He could not remember the last time he had heard that kind of laughter on this property. He turned around and went back into the barn. He needed to finish checking the water line in the east trough anyway. He stayed in there for a while. Day 38. A night storm. Bad one. The thunder woke Nora at 1:45 a.m. She sat up and looked out the window and saw, in the lightning, that the north fence line was down in 2 places. She could see it clearly in the intermittent light, the posts leaning, the wire loose and flapping. She put on her rain jacket and boots and went out. Cole was already heading to the truck with supplies. He saw her, said, "You do not have to." She said, "Which posts?" He showed her. They drove out in the rain and the dark and worked for nearly 2 hours in the mud with the lightning moving around them. No conversation that was not about the work. "Pass me the wire, hold that post, 2 more this way." When the last section was done, they sat down in the wet grass with their backs against a fence post, both of them exhausted and soaked through, breathing hard. Nora started laughing. Cole looked at her. She said between breaths, "I am sitting in mud at 4 in the morning in a rainstorm in Texas." He said, "You are." She said, "I grew up in Montana, and then I spent 2 years in a desert, and then I spent 8 years in a city, and I am somehow back in mud at 4 in the morning, and this is the most like myself I have felt in a very long time." He looked at her in the dark. Rain still coming down around them, her face wet and mud-streaked and tired, and something else underneath all that. He reached over slowly, the same way he moved toward Rebel. His thumb found the mud on her cheekbone and wiped it away. His hand stayed for a moment at her jaw, the warm pressure of it against the cold rain. Then he pulled it back. She did not move. She forgot to breathe for a moment. He stood up, held out his hand. She took it and stood. They walked back to the truck in a silence that had heat in it. At the barn, they went their separate ways without saying anything, but Nora stood in the doorway of her room for a few minutes before she went inside, looking up at the house, at the light that stayed on in Cole's window. The handprint the next morning was the same as always, but Cole stood in front of it longer. He was thinking about that moment in the rain, about the fact that he had reached over without planning to, about the fact that it felt like the most natural thing he had done in 6 years, and also like something that was going to cost him if he was not careful. He thought about careful. He thought about not yet, not yet, not yet. Then he walked to the barn, day 45, a Tuesday. Nora was in the kitchen, phone to her ear. Cole was passing through to get his gloves from the hook by the back door. He heard a voice on the phone. Male. Smooth in the practiced way of someone who had negotiated from positions of confidence for a long time. The voice said, "How long have you been staying with the cowboy? Does he know what you brought with you? You think he's going to want to keep you when he finds out?" Nora said into the phone, "Do not call this number again." She hung up. She turned around. Cole was standing in the doorway with his gloves in his hand. She said, "How much did you hear?" He said, "Enough to know you have not told me everything." She told him. She sat at the kitchen table and told him about Thomas and the lawsuit and the document he needed her to sign and the fact that he had found out where she was. She told it plainly. No over-explanation, no deflection. Cole stood against the far wall and listened to all of it. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then he said, "You knew there was a chance he would find you." She said, "I thought there was a chance." He said, "You knew his looking for you might come here, might affect this place." She said, "I did not think he would, actually." He said, "But you knew it was possible." She said, "Yes." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet and without theater, and that was in some ways worse than if he had been angry. He said, "I let you and your son into this property. I trusted you here, and you were carrying something that you knew could follow you in, and you did not tell me." She said, "I know." He said, "If you had told me, I could have made a real decision. Instead, I was making decisions based on incomplete information." She said, "Cole," he said, "I need some time." He picked up his gloves, walked out the back door. Nora sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he left. She was not angry at his response. She understood it. She had understood it even as she was telling him, watching his face, watching him work through the math of what she should have said and when. The thing was, he was right. She had known Thomas might look for her. She had known that bringing that uncertainty into this place was a risk for Cole. And she had stayed quiet about it, not because she thought it would be fine, but because she was afraid of what would happen if she said it out loud and he decided the risk was not worth it. That was the reflex Thomas had spent 8 years building in her. Hide the complications, present the acceptable version. Do not give someone a reason to tell you to leave before you are ready to go. She had promised herself she was done living that way. She had broken that promise. She went to find Ruth. Ruth listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" Nora said, "I think I need to call Junie about the room she mentioned." Ruth said, "You are going to leave." Nora said, "I brought this here. That is on me to manage. I cannot manage it from inside his house." Ruth looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "That is either very wise or very stupid, and I'm not sure which." Nora said, "Maybe both." She packed that evening while Eli slept. Quietly, each item placed with care. She called Junie at 9 p.m. Junie said yes before she finished explaining. $300 a month whenever you can manage it. She carried the bags to the truck in the dark, 2 trips, while the light in Cole's window stayed on. The next morning, 5:30, Cole walked into the yard. He turned toward the window. The glass was clean. No handprint, just the flat, pale surface of it, unmarked. He stood there, looked at the clean glass. Then he looked toward the barn room. The door was shut. The truck was gone. A note on the room door in Nora's handwriting said, "Thank you for everything. The key is inside." He stood in the yard for a long time. Then he went to the barn, started the morning feeding, moved through it the way he moved through everything when there was nothing else to do, with method and completion and no space in between for anything that would not help. At 7:30, he drove past the school. Eli was not at the door. Junie's sedan was pulling away from the curb. Cole drove home. He looked at the window when he parked. Still clean. 2 days, then 3. Cole worked. He repaired fencing he did not need to repair yet. He went through the storage shed and reorganized it completely. He checked and rechecked water levels in every trough on the property. He did not eat much. He slept poorly. Ruth came both days, and both days he gave her one-word answers until she stopped trying, and sat with her newspaper in the kitchen, which was something, having someone in the kitchen even if neither of them was talking. The second night he went out to Rebel's stall at dusk. He sat down on the barn floor across from the stall gate, back against the wall, the way Eli had done every afternoon for weeks. He sat there for 2 hours in the cooling dark. Rebel, after the first hour, came to the front of the stall, stood there looking at him. After a while, the horse's head dropped, and he stood with his eyes half closed, present and not afraid. Cole sat with that and thought about patience and about what it meant to earn something slowly. He thought about Eli drawing horses from imagination on his first night in this place. He thought about a word scratched in dust, home. He thought about the clean window. Ruth came out at 9 o'clock. She sat down in the dirt beside him without a word. After a few minutes, she said, "You have been working those fence posts with empty hands for too long." Cole said, "I know." She said, "Then what are you doing sitting in a barn?" He did not answer, but in the morning he was up before 5. He stood in the yard and looked at the clean window one more time. Then he went inside, got his keys, and walked to his truck. Ruth was at the kitchen table when he came through for his keys. She looked up. He said, "I'm going to find somebody." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "It has been a long time since you went looking for anyone." He heard her. He did not stop. He knew where Nora was. Marfa was small. In a town this size, you did not lose track of people even if you were trying to. He drove to Junie's place, parked in front, sat in the truck for 1 minute. He was not rehearsing anything. He was not planning what to say. He was thinking about what was true, which was the only thing worth saying. He got out and knocked. Junie opened the door. looked at Cole, looked at the yard, looked back at Cole, said nothing, and stepped aside. Nora was in the small kitchen off the hallway. She came out when she heard the knock. She stopped when she saw him. Junie went upstairs. Her footsteps on the stairs, and then silence. Cole came inside. He stood in the middle of the room. She stood at the kitchen doorway. They looked at each other. He said, "The envelope you sent me." She said, "You do not owe me anything for that." He said, "I did not come here to talk about the envelope." She looked at him. He said, "You should have told me about Thomas from the beginning. That part is true, and I am not taking it back." He paused. "But I handled it in a way I did not need to. You did not come here empty-handed and wait around. You worked. You helped me with things I could not have managed alone, in the barn and in other ways. That was real. I knew it was real. I let one hard moment convince me to ignore 6 weeks of real. That is on me." She was quiet. He said, "Eli asked me something 3 weeks ago. Asked whether Rebel would remember him if they stayed longer." She said, "Cole." He said, "I told him yes." He met her eyes. "I do not say things like that easily. I said it because somewhere in me, by that point, I had already stopped thinking of you and your son as temporary. I had not examined it. I just said yes because it was true." She was still looking at him. Her arms were crossed, but not in defense, more like she was holding herself steady. He said, "I have been looking at a clean window for 4 days. Every morning I go out to the yard, and it is not there. And it took not seeing it to understand how much I had been counting on it. That is not guilt. That is understanding something too late and trying not to let too late become permanent." The longest speech Cole McAllister had made in 6 years. Nora stood there. She looked at the floor, then back up at him. She said, "I spent 8 years learning to hide my complications because I thought if I showed them I would lose my place. That is not who I was before him, and it is not who I want to be now. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning." He said, "You should have." She said, "And you should not have shut the door before letting me explain." He said, "I should not have." She nodded, said, "So we both did something wrong." He said, "We did." She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the back room door and opened it. She said, "Eli." Eli came out in his socks, sketchbook in hand, saw Cole, and went completely still. His face did what his face rarely did. It showed exactly what he was feeling, which was a hope he did not want to admit to. Cole crouched down to the boy's level. He said, "You want to come back?" Eli said, "Will Rebel remember me?" Cole said, "He has been waiting." They drove back to the ranch in 2 vehicles. Nora's truck behind Cole's, the same way as the very first morning, except in the opposite direction, coming toward the ranch instead of away from it. Ruth was on the porch. She watched them pull in, and she nodded once with a satisfaction she did not try to conceal. That night, Ruth pulled Nora aside in the kitchen and put a weathered envelope in her hand. Said, "Margaret gave this to me before she passed. She said if Cole ever found somebody to give it to that person." Nora opened it at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to the front room. The letter was short, written in a clear, careful hand on folded notebook paper. It said, "He will not tell you what he needs. He will show you instead. He will hand you something when your hands are empty and not explain why. He will stay when staying is hard and not make anything of it. Do not mistake his quiet for distance. That is just the shape of how he loves. I hope you figure it out faster than I did. It took me 3 years to understand I was already loved. Do not waste 3 years." Nora read it twice, folded it carefully, held it in both hands for a moment. She thought about the roll of first aid tape left on the fence post without a word. The coffee poured without asking. The key to the truck offered before she knew she needed it. The print on the window that he never once wiped away. She had already been seeing all of it. She had just been calling it something else. She sat there at the kitchen table for a long time. Outside through the window, She could see Cole on the back porch with Eli, the two of them sitting side by side in the dark, Eli talking about something with his hands, Cole listening. She folded the letter again and put it in her pocket. That night, Eli went to the window as always. He stood in the yard in the dark, facing Cole's bedroom window. He did not put his hand on the glass. He walked to the front door and knocked. 2 light taps. Cole opened it. He said, "Something wrong?" Eli said, "No. I just wanted to make sure you knew we were home." Cole looked at the boy. His face, in the porch light, was doing the thing it sometimes did when he was not paying attention to it. He said, "I know." Eli nodded and went to bed. Cole stood in the open doorway for a while. He looked up at his own window from the porch. Clean. No handprint, because the boy had knocked on the door instead. He stood there and felt for the first time in 6 years that the empty space in this house was not something he was protecting. It was something he was done with. He went inside and turned off the porch light. The debt was settled on the 44th day. Cole had 3 days to spare. The 20 head of cattle brought $41,000 at auction. Ruth's $35,000. The Marfa community raised $27,000 at a Saturday auction that Junie organized with 4 days of planning. Everyone bringing what they had, no one making it into a charity event. Just the plain and functional care of neighbors who had known each other for decades and who understood that this was how it worked out here. This was how it had always worked. Nora's clinic contract came through. Dr. Vasquez structured a $20,000 advance on salary. The clinic had needed someone with Nora's background for 2 years. It was not charity. It was a legitimate business arrangement. The last $3,000 came from a tooled leather saddle that had been in the McAllister family for 65 years. Cole brought it to a dealer in Marfa on a Monday morning and walked out with $3,200 and the particular feeling of a man who has set down a weight he had been carrying out of habit rather than necessity. Total, $126,200. Cole and Nora drove to Odessa together. They sat across the desk from Shaw and his lawyer, and Cole placed the cashier's check on the desk. Shaw picked it up, read the amount, read the accompanying legal brief from Cole's Odessa attorney, citing the provision by page and section number. His jaw tightened slightly, once, and then he was composed again. He said, "Section 14B thorough." Cole said, "Debt paid in full, per the original agreement." Shaw looked at Nora for a moment. She looked back at him without expression. He signed the release. He shook Cole's hand with the same warmth he had always used. He said, "Ranch looks good, Cole." Cole said, "And it is still mine." They walked out of the building into the Odessa afternoon. The street was bright and flat and loud with ordinary life. Cole stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the sky for a moment. Nora stood beside him. She said, "Done." He turned to her. He did not go slowly this time. He put his hand on her face and kissed her, the kind of kiss that is not a question. She kissed him back. She was 44 years old, and she had spent 8 years learning to be smaller than she was, and she did not do that now, and it was the best she had felt in a very long time. 8 months later. October. The morning air in Marfa had turned cool. Cole and Nora were on the north fence line, the same section they had repaired 100 times. The one that seemed to give out on a seasonal schedule. Cole stopped working. He said, "Eli asked me something yesterday." Nora kept her hands on the wire but went still. Cole said, "He asked if he could call me Dad." She turned to look at him. He said, "I told him I needed to ask you first." He met her eyes. "Do you want him to?" She said, "I do." "Do you want him to?" He said, "I want everything that comes with that question, if you want the same. No ring produced from a pocket. No formal location selected for the occasion. Just 2 people standing on a Texas fence line in the October wind, saying out loud what had already been decided in every quiet action over the past 8 months. Nora nodded. Once. The same deliberate nod she had used on the first morning when they made their arrangement. Except this time it was not about survival. It was entirely a choice. 3 months after that. January. The wedding was outside, on the ranch, under a sky so wide and clear it seemed to take in the entire world. 42 people came. Ruth sat in the front row and did not cry until the vows, which is a personal record she was proud of. Eli stood beside Cole in a dark blue blazer he had picked out himself. He stood there straight and still, sketchbook in his jacket pocket, and watched his mother walk across the yard toward them, with the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to set it down and stay. Cole said, "I had stopped believing I was a place anyone would want to stay. You and Eli changed that. I will not waste it." Nora said, "I spent years learning to take up less space to fit inside someone else's life. You are the first person who never asked me to." "I will not forget it," Junie cried. Ruth held it together for 20 more seconds and then did not. Eli drew the whole thing in his sketchbook afterward, from memory. He filled 7 pages. He drew the sky and the yard and the people and his mother's face and Cole's hands. He drew Biscuit watching from the corral, her big chestnut head over the fence rail. He drew 2 hands, side by side, spring morning, early. The kind of morning that comes in West Texas like an apology for how hot the summer is going to be. Cool and clear and so still you can hear things from half a mile away. Eli was 12. He woke up before his alarm, which he had started doing in the past year, growing into the early hours the way ranch kids do, drawn to the first light without knowing exactly why. He lay in his bed for a minute looking at the ceiling. His room had been repainted 2 years ago, blue-gray, his choice. There was a bookshelf on the east wall that he had built himself with Cole over a weekend. The 2 of them in the workshop, measuring and cutting, Cole letting him make the mistakes, and then helping him fix them without making it into a lesson. On the shelf, 14 filled sketchbooks, a row of novels, a photograph of him on Rebel taken from behind, both of them mid-canter, the flatland spreading out ahead of them. He got up and went to the window. Down in the yard, Cole was at the water trough checking the float valve, the same task he did every Tuesday and Friday, regardless of season. His movements were the same as they had always been, unhurried and exact. On the back porch, Nora sat with her coffee in both hands, looking out at the pasture. She was in her work clothes, clinic day, but she was not rushing. She had learned to keep the first 20 minutes of morning for herself, for the coffee and the view and the particular silence of early light. They were not looking at each other, they were just there, in the same space, the way people are when they have stopped needing to prove anything. Eli watched them for a minute. He thought about the word safe. Not the small kind, not the absence of danger. The real kind. The kind that meant, if something goes wrong, you are not going to face it by yourself. He could not have defined it at 7. He knew it exactly now. He went downstairs. Ruth was at the table with her newspaper. She was 77, and she had moved into the room off the main house 2 years ago, after her 3rd fall on the stairs at her own place. Cole had asked her before she finished suggesting it. She had been pretending to read for the past 20 minutes, waiting for Eli. Eli said, "How long have we been here?" She did not look up from the paper. She said, 5 years, 2 months, 3 days. He said, "You just know that." She put down the paper and looked at him over her reading glasses. She said, "The days that matter, you remember." He thought about that. He took his coffee outside. Cole was finishing with the trough and saw him coming and waited. They walked to the barn together. Rebel heard them coming and was already at the gate. The horse dropped his big head and breathed into Eli's chest when he reached him. The long, warm breath that Eli had felt so many times now. It was part of his body's memory. Eli put his hand on the horse's neck. His hand, now broad across the palm, the beginning of calluses at the base of his fingers. A ranch kid's hand, a hand that had done real work. He stood there for a moment in the early morning quiet of the barn, the horse warm against his palm, Cole standing a few feet back with his hands in his pockets. Eli thought about a morning 5 years ago. Standing in a stranger's yard in the dark, putting his hand on a stranger's window, because he needed to know the house was not empty. Because he needed proof of life. He had been so afraid then, of the next move and the one after that, and of what it would feel like to need someone and have them not be there. He was not afraid of that anymore. Cole said, "You ready?" Eli looked back at him. His father. The man who had answered a knock at a front door and said, "I know," and meant it. Eli said, "Yeah, I am ready." They saddled up in the early light and rode out into the cool spring morning, across the flat red land of Marfa, Texas, under a sky so wide it held everything. Cole thought about the handprint sometimes. He thought about it on mornings like this one, when the ranch was quiet and the light was good and the work ahead of him was clear. He thought about standing in the yard in the gray dark, looking at a small dirty hand pressed against his window. The way he had stood there. The way he had chosen, without knowing fully why, not to wipe it away. He had not known it would change everything. He had only known that someone was standing outside in the dark, asking a question with their hand on the glass. And he had been home. That was all it took. That had always been all it took. Be there. Be home. Be the kind of person that someone looking for light can find. The rest followed from that. All of it. Every good thing. He put his heels to his horse and rode out to where Eli was waiting at the edge of the north pasture, sketchbook tucked in the saddlebag in case inspiration struck, the flat Texas morning opening up ahead of them like something given freely, like something chosen, like something worth every difficult mile of getting there. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
There is a moment in this story that stays with you long after the last page. A 7-year-old boy in the dark, before sunrise, pressing his small, dirty hand against a stranger's window. Not knocking, not asking for anything, just needing to know that someone was in there, just needing proof that the house was not empty. That image is small, but what it carries is not small at all. This story is about what happens to people when life asks more of them than they were prepared to give. Nora arrived at that ranch with $47, a broken truck, and a version of herself she barely recognized anymore. 8 years of a marriage that slowly, quietly asked her to be less capable, less independent, less of the woman she had been before she agreed to stop being that woman. She did not lose herself in one dramatic moment. She lost herself in small surrenders, one at a time, until the day she looked in the mirror and did not know who was looking back. That is the kind of damage most people never talk about, because it leaves no visible marks, because from the outside, everything looked fine. And Cole was not broken either. He was managing. He had the land and the work and the daily routine of a man who has decided that surviving is enough. He had stopped wanting things, stopped expecting things, because wanting and expecting are the parts of you that hurt the most when they go unanswered. What this story teaches us is that healing does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives the way Nora arrived, unexpectedly, impractically, with a dead engine and a hungry child and nowhere else to go. It arrives the way Eli arrived at that window every morning, without agenda, without demand, just present, just asking the simplest question a person can ask another person: are you there? The moral of this story is not that love conquers all. It is quieter and more honest than that. It is this: the people who change your life are rarely the ones who arrive with grand intentions. They are the ones who show up at the wrong time, in the wrong circumstances, and stay anyway. They are the ones who hand you something when your hands are empty and do not explain why. They are the ones who sit beside a frightened horse for weeks without rushing because they understand that trust is not demanded. It is earned, slowly, consistently, with patience that does not ask for recognition. And perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that it is never too late to be found. Not at 44, not at 48, not after the wrong marriage or the wrong choices or the years you spent being smaller than you were. The window is still there, the light is still on. All that is required is for someone to be home when you come looking. And all that is required of you is to go looking before the glass goes clean.